Okay, so we've got our custom 3-tier brewing system here, consisting of hot liquor tank, which is a 50 litre keg heated by a 3-ring burner, down to our 55 litre cooler mash tun, which has a polyethylene, high density polyethylene manifold in it, so the grain doesn't go through it. Coming out to a tap to control outflow into our 50 litre boil kettle, which is a 50 litre camping stockpot. Okay, first step is to grind a grain. We've got 2.9 kilos of Barrett Durston Pale Ale Malt, 250 grams of Best Miles Carahell, which is a very light crystal malt, a Munich style for Hellas. So into the 2-roller which is powered by a AEG Almighty Egg Gang cordless drill. Okay, fire it up. Just going to run it very slowly.
It smells absolutely awesome.
A bit to the rodent. You through. It's just one free roller, one driven roller with knurling on them. So take the grinder off. You can see we're left with a fairly even, coarse grist. A lot of those husks are still intact. And a lot of flour. That should open up the grain so most of the sugars are accessible. Okay, next step we're going to test our mash water temperature. We want to mash this at about 63 to 64 degrees Celsius, which is, I think, approximately 148 Fahrenheit. So I'll just stick my digital thermometer in there. It's just a cheap barbecue thermometer. It's coming up. So the grain will probably pull 4 or 5 degrees Celsius out of the water temperature. So I'm aiming for it to be in between 68 to 70. It's probably 12 degrees, 14 degrees ambient. So we're looking pretty good. It's going to sit at about 70. Let's say 70 degrees Celsius now. So for 3 kilo of grain, or 3.125 kilo of grain, the general rule of thumb is 2.6 litres of strike water per kilo of grain. And I'm going to go for a reasonably thin mash, so I'm going to put about just over 10 litres in this, which you'll lose approximately 3 to 4 litres of water retention in the grain. So I'm hoping to pull about 7.5, 8 litres out, and I'll sparge it twice. with about 7.5, 8 litres, which should give me a total boil volume of approximately 25 litres. I've done the maths more precisely, but they're my rough figures. So I'm going to measure out approximately 10 litres of our water. Hold this to the finger. Put it into our tun. Make sure the tap's turned off.
Yeah, it's on.
On the tun.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll measure it out one jug at a time. We'll recheck it for temp and we've got our desired volume in the tun. So we'll just check the temperature in there. If it's a little bit too high, we'll let it lower. It should lower pretty quickly in there, having quite a large surface area. Okay, so it's still a bit warm for our liking. I don't know how it just got hotter, but it says 73 now. Okay, so we're about 5 degrees higher than our desired mash temperature, so I'm just going to slowly add the grain. Well, there's a fair bit of water in there, so I don't know, I'll have to be slow. Yeah, this is going to be a fairly thin mash, so if there's any real worries about dough balling. Oh, I forgot to mention this. Just work it in. This water was pH'd to the correct pH, which was about 6, and it's had salts added to it. I don't know the exact numbers, but more calcium chloride than gypsum, being a malt forward beer, to accentuate the maltiness. Yeah, some gypsum, a little bit of Epsom salt, magnesium sulfate obviously, some sodium bicarbonate, and I think that's it. Because I've brewed with straight rainwater here, which is fine, but it doesn't hurt to add a bit of salts, a bit of extra nutrients to help with the mash and the enzymatic conversion and give the something a few minerals for the yeast to feed on. Alright, so it looks like we're coming pretty close to our temp. It's probably going to wind up at 63, which is exactly what we were aiming for. 62.6. It's probably a dash hotter than that, a bit high. Yeah, see right at the bottom, I'll give that a bit of a stir. And I reckon lit it, the average temperature is probably close to what we want. A degree or so either way. Shouldn't make a hell of a difference anyway. So it's still a little warm. I'll give it another stir, I'll leave the lid off. Well, I'll grab my pH meter, which is probably the perfect delay time to get a pH reading on that mash. Okay, so I got my fancy new pH meter. We're aiming for a pH of probably 5.8 to about 6.2. So straight off the bat we're already at 6.2, 6.1. It's dropping, give it time to stabilise. Alright, well that looks good to me, I'm going to call that. She's still dropping. 596, 595, 594, 593, 592. It will alter as the mash progresses naturally, and these auto temperature correcting pH meters are always going to wander a bit too. So it wants to set it slowed right down. It's probably about 5.9, high 5.8 to 5.9, which is adequate. So we hit that number. Just rinse my pH meter off. And these things, you got to keep them stored wet. Looks like our mash good. Let's just take the temp again. We'll just take one final temp before we shut it up, and then leave it for an hour of saccharification, which is the conversion of starches into sugars. Come up, it should be sitting at about 64 now. So you got a few hot spots. Alright, we're perfect. Give it one last stir and lid on. Yep, that'll do. Lid on. You cover it in a blanket.
Yeah.
Our trusty blanket.
Bedtime for mash time.
We'll come back in an hour. Go and watch memes on the internet.
Say that again.
So the mash has been done for an hour, so the next stage is to lauter it, which is taking the wort off the liquor to be brewed. So if you see the mash, it's settled now. So you've got a bed of grain which will act as a filter. So I'm going to take one jug off. Slowly run it out. Until that runs out reasonably clear. I've already done it once. It's still a bit cloudy, but you can see it's getting clearer. See it in the hose, there's a few particles. It is getting clearer. So the idea is to get all this fine sediment that's settled to the bottom out, pour it back in the top and let it filter through the grain bed. It's almost clear now. It doesn't have to be crystal clear, it just doesn't want to be murky. So I'll just gently pour that back through over the back of the spoon so as not to disturb the grain bed too much. Let's check one more time. It's almost clear now. So now we could run that straight into the boil kettle. But I'm going to measure it on the way in. You don't want to come out too fast. So that's roughly what our beer colour is going to be.
Quite nice.
Similar to BB 4X Australian lager sort of colour.
Pretty average for a Kolsch.
A bit darker than a Kolsch. Bit on the darker end, maybe.
Yeah. You can see some of the liquid is starting to seep from the mash.
Yeah, you want it to run slowly through the mash so as not to disturb it too much.
Yeah, it stays in position.
Okay, so we got just under 6 litres out into our kettle. So I'm going to double batch sparge this. Sparging is just using more water to wash the excess sugars. My fingers are sticky from that, like that's quite sugary. You taste it, it's pretty sweet. So I'm going to do one batch of 10 litres. All of that should come out, which will get me to 16. So I really want to be at 24, 25. So I'm going to have to do 10 litres and about 9 litres. So I've got my sparge water just heating a bit higher than what we used at mash temperature, which will do a bit of a mash out process, raise the temperature a few degrees to stop the saccharification, to remove the residual enzymes or denature them. So we do have some residual sugars in our beer. So there's 2. Four. And I'm only doing it in 2 stages. You could do it in 1, but you just do it in 2 to keep the grain bed a bit more solid rather than put too much water in the mash as you sparge. Six. 10 and just a dash more. To account for some loss in the vessel. Okay, so we won't cover that, we'll just leave it sit for 5 minutes to settle. Okay, so we've given a few minutes for that to settle. You can see it's looking reasonably settled. I've already run one off, it's coming out pretty clear. See, it's a little bit lighter, but still pretty clear. It do. Just edit. Alright, we've got our kettle up. So now we want to boil this for an hour. So we'll crank it up. Takes a while to get up to heat. Now this is just a cheap stockpot with a thin bottom, but the flame's fairly well distributed, so we shouldn't get any real scorching. So now it's just a matter of throw the lid on and wait. We'll go measure out our hops. So we're using lemondrop, pelletized. Quite a light colour. They smell a bit lemony.
Yeah, it's like a rind of a lemon.
More like cannabis. So we're putting 20 grams of these at an hour in the boil. That's 22. Which isn't a lot. I mean, a Kolsch is, I don't know, approximately 24, 25 IBUs of bitterness. This should give us 18. I'm going to put some hops in at 10 minutes or in the no chill cooling period, which should bring our bitterness up to just below a Kolsch, because I don't want this to be as bitter as a full Kolsch, because it's only going to be 3.5% or 3.7%. So once this hits boil, we'll throw these in. We might put them in a bag. Right, so we've had that on the burner for a while now. It's coming up to a boil. You can see that head there, that break forming, that's the protein starting to coagulate and rise to the top. You can see there's a bit of any dirt or residues or whatever is in that grain. We usually get caught by that. You know, some people like to skim that off, and some people leave it in. You can see it's just about to boil now. That break's starting to foam. See bubbles coming up. So that's your first break there, and I'm actually going to skim some of that because it's a bit dark for my liking. But I guess if you take too much of it out, that is some of the proteins that form the head, but I mean, it doesn't look very nice. You can see it is actually quite, it's not just foam, it's quite a solid protein. So I'll just skim the bulk of it off. At least the darker stuff. You can see the protein flakes starting to form as they coagulate and the beer clears up. So we're going to call that start of our 60 minutes. We're going to add our hops. We'll probably get a bit of foaming when these go in. And that smell is pretty amazing. Okay, so now we'll let that boil for an hour. It's a fairly vigorous boil. Okay, we're checking how much sugar's in the wort. So I've cooled that down to just over 20 degrees. I'll float my hydrometer in there. Can you see the numbers? So that's sitting on about 1030.
Yeah.
So it's still a little bit warm. I think we were aiming for 1034. So we're pretty close to our numbers. Yeah, it's slowly coming up. It's nearly 1032 now. So 1032 starting gravity should give us about a 3.5, 3.7% beer. I'll just put that sample back in. Plus we left the boil go a bit longer while we were mucking around. So it would have dropped a little bit since then. Okay, so we'll whirlpool now. I'm actually going to put a few grams of hops in the whirlpool too. Okay, so I'm going to do some whirlpool hops. There's 5 more grams. Straight in. Lost one. And now the whirlpool is just what it sounds like. It's just a whirlpool. So that's whirlpooling around. So that should settle all our hops and protein residue to a cone in the bottom.
I mean, you start to see it now.
Alright, there's our wort nice and settled. I'm just going to use this easy siphon to siphon it out into our bucket, which will be we're doing no chill, so I'm going to put it in that sterilised bucket, seal it up, leave it overnight to cool down to yeast pitching temperature, and I'll pitch the yeast tomorrow and transfer it into a fermenter. So this thing you just start siphoning like that. As you can see, it's pretty much coming out crystal clear. It's going to be a nice beer.
Yeah, it's actually a really good colour.
And that's what you want. The clearer you get it out of the boil, the clearer it will come out of the fermenter, generally speaking. You have a look in there now, you can see some of the flakes of coagulated protein.
Yeah, you can see it sheen on the top.
That'll be hop oils, the sheen.
And you see the light reflecting on the little bits.
So I'll probably lose a litre or two in the bottom of this, leaving the sediment. And then it can sediment in the no chill container overnight too. There you can see our cone. which was pretty much a perfect whirlpool. There's nothing's come out.
Yeah.
I mean, this stuff probably wouldn't hurt if it went in the fermenter, but it just makes everything a bit easier. You can avoid racking that tube into the no-chill container, and you don't have to be so careful racking it later.
You can see here just the last of this process, avoiding all the muck. And the bucket's pretty much full.
Alright, so we probably got just under 20 litres in that bucket, so our boil was pretty accurate. So we might lose a litre in the rest of the process, which should fill our 19 litre keg perfectly. So let's get our sterilised lid. Pass me the Stella sand.
Genocide liquid.
Just re-sterilise that. Just get the top of the bucket. That's a phosphoric acid based sanitizer. It
Doesn't matter if it gets a few drops in the beer.
The flavour of the beer. The yeast will actually consume that during fermentation. It's actually a mild yeast nutrient. There we go. There's our no-chill container.
Truly high profile.
We'll leave that to cool down and pitch the yeast tomorrow. I forgot to put our extra 5 grams of hops in there, but it should be fine. We'll just dry hop it instead.
No, I think we put in the extra 5.
No, there's meant to be 5 in the bucket too.
Ah, okay.
Anyway, there's your mash and brew process.
Quick, cheap brewing setup.
Right. See how much scorch? You can see our hot plate is set almost perfectly. There's 0 scorching there. It's a little bit stuck to the bottom, but it hasn't turned black. So I don't know how people scorch their beers, because that's a thin bottom pot, that one. And I didn't get any scorching.
Gas off.
Done.
Good stuff.
It's a lemon drop smash time, bitch. Look at that. Crystal clear. Queensland malt. Barrett burst and lemondrop. Gold ale clone.